I don't talk about Yellowstone much anymore. People hear the word and they picture geysers, tourists, bison grazing along the roadsides. They don't picture what I saw in the Beckler region in July of 2022. And I've learned that trying to explain it only leads to the kind of polite, patient look that people give you when they've already decided you've been alone in the wilderness too long. I'd been a backcountry ranger for 9 years by that point. I want you to understand what that means before anything else, because context matters here. I wasn't a seasonal hire, wasn't someone still learning to read topo lines or identify thermal hazard zones. I knew that parked the way you know your own house in the dark by feel, by instinct, by 9 years of walking sections of it that the brochures don't bother to mention. The Beckler region sits in the southwest corner of the park, remote even by Yellowstone standards, cut off from the main visitor corridors by distance and bad roads, and a landscape that feels, even on calm days, like it isn't entirely comfortable with human presence. I'd patrolled it dozens of times. I knew its smells, sulfur and pine, and the particular mineral sharpness that clings to the air near active thermal ground. I knew its sounds. I knew what it looked like when the land had been altered by heat from below, the bleached soil, the orange and yellow mineral staining, the ring of dead and dying vegetation that surrounds every thermal feature like a warning. That's why the pool stopped me the moment I saw it. I'd come through the tree line into a long, open meadow, the grass green and waist-high in places, the kind of lush growth you get near water sources in July. The sky was high and blue and the morning was clear, good visibility in every direction, nothing moving except the grass and a light wind. And in the center of that meadow, maybe 200 yards ahead of me, was a pool of water I had never seen before and had no record of, steaming heavily in the cool morning air. My first thought was practical. Thermal features in Yellowstone are dynamic. The underground plumbing shifts constantly. Pressure builds and releases. New vents open. It wasn't impossible for a feature to develop in a location not yet captured in the Geological Survey database. I'd heard of it happening. I reached for my radio, noted my coordinates, and started across the meadow toward it to take readings. I was maybe 30 yards out when I slowed down, then stopped. The ground around the pool was wrong. Not just unusual wrong, in a way that my body registered before my mind caught up to it. Every thermal feature in Yellowstone is surrounded by altered ground. The heat and the chemistry do visible things to the earth. Over time, mineral deposits build up in layers. The soil bleaches out to white and gray and pale orange. The vegetation dies back in a kill zone that can extend 20, 30 feet from the water's edge. That alteration takes years, sometimes decades. You can read it in the ground the same way you can read age in tree rings. It's the record of what's been happening there. The ground around this pool was green, not just survivable, not just clinging on green and healthy and dense with grass that pressed right up to the water's edge. A pool that steamed the way this one did, in a thermal area, should have been sitting in a ring of dead earth. Instead, it looked like someone had set a basin of water down in the middle of a healthy meadow 10 minutes before I arrived. I kept walking, slower now, and stopped at the edge. The pool was maybe 20 feet across, roughly circular. The water a deep, clear blue that was almost beautiful. The steam came off it in thin, steady ribbons, and the surface was flat. I stood there for a long moment trying to process that, because it didn't make sense in a way I could not immediately articulate. Thermal pools in Yellowstone are never flat. The water is heated from below, sometimes hundreds of feet below, and that heat drives constant convection. The water moves, circulates, bubbles near the vents, shows the constant restless motion of something driven by pressure and temperature. Even the calmest looking thermal pools, if you watch them for 30 seconds, reveal their nature. You see the subtle upwelling, the slow roiling, the way the surface catches the movement of what's happening beneath it. This surface was motionless, flat as a pane of glass. The steam rose from it as if from nothing, as if the heat were emanating from the water itself rather than from anything beneath it, and the water did not move. Not even the wind disturbed it. I watched for what felt like a long time, and the surface held absolutely still. I knelt at the edge. The ground under my boot was solid, cool, completely normal soil. I could feel no heat radiating from the earth, none of the warmth that you feel when you approach active thermal ground. I looked into the water. It was deep, much deeper than it should have been for its size, the blue color deepening quickly to a shade that was almost purple, and then to black below that, a darkness at the bottom that I couldn't assign a depth to. In 9 years of thermal patrol, I'd looked into dozens of pools, and I had a working sense of depth, of what 20 feet of water looks like versus 40. This looked like more than that. This looked like less of a pool and more of a vertical shaft. The opening wide, but the drop beneath it, suggesting something that went down much further than the surface dimensions implied. And at the bottom, or at what I understood as the bottom, since I couldn't be sure something was moving, I want to be precise about this because I've replayed it 1,000 times. It wasn't moving toward me. It wasn't ascending. Whatever I was seeing existed at that depth and was moving within it, a slow, wide, circular motion, like something large turning in a space that was just barely large enough to contain it. The movement was patient, unhurried. It had the quality of something that had been doing exactly this for a very long time and intended to continue doing it regardless of anything happening at the surface. I stood up. I backed away from the edge. My hands were shaking and I didn't fully register that until I tried to key my radio and fumbled it. I reported the coordinates. I described what I found. I used the language we use for anomalous thermal features, trying to keep my voice level, trying to sound like a ranger filing a routine report, and not like someone who had just looked into something they did not have words for. The geology team went out 2 days later. I wasn't with them. I was on a different patrol section, which was probably deliberate on someone's part, though no one said so directly. They found nothing. That's what the report said. Green meadow, no pool, no thermal activity, no evidence of water at those coordinates, no mineral staining, no ground disturbance, no indication that anything had ever been present at that location. The colleague who told me the results watched my face when he said it, the way you watch someone's face when you're trying to determine if they're going to hold together or come apart. I held together, I thanked him, and went back to my work. I transferred out of the Beckler region the following spring. I told people it was for personal reasons, which was easier than the truth, which was that I could not make myself walk that section of the park anymore. Not because I was afraid of finding the pool again, because of the nights after. Because for months following that morning in the meadow, I would wake in the dark with the absolute, unshakable certainty that something below me was turning, slowly, patiently, not coming up, just turning, the way it had been turning when I looked down into it, the way it would still be turning when I looked away, the way it would keep turning long after I was gone, and the meadow had grown back over whatever opening had briefly existed there, and the water had closed, and the surface had gone still and flat and beautiful in the morning light, with the steam rising from it like breath, like something breathing, far below, that had no intention of surfacing, that had no need to. I worked night patrol in the Lamar Valley during calving season, which runs from mid-April through late May, the weeks when the bison herds that winter in the valley give birth to calves that are vulnerable to predation and to the particular brand of human stupidity that Yellowstone attracts, in the form of people who want to get close to wildlife, without understanding that wildlife in Yellowstone will kill you with the same indifference that the weather will. My job is to drive the valley road after dark, watching for poachers who target newborn calves, monitoring the herds through night vision optics, and generally serving as the park's presence in a landscape that most visitors only see in daylight, and that is a fundamentally different place after the sun goes down. The Lamar Valley at night is one of the most extraordinary environments I've ever experienced. The valley is broad and open, maybe a mile wide in places, flanked by ridges that rise steeply on both sides, the Absaroka Range to the east, and the Mirror Plateau to the west. During the day, it's Yellowstone's most popular wildlife viewing area, packed with spotting scopes and telephoto lenses, and the excited murmur of tourists watching wolves and bears and bison go about their business in a landscape that looks like a nature documentary come to life. At night, the tourists are gone, and the valley belongs to the animals. And the animals use it differently in the dark, the herds bedding down in positions they wouldn't occupy during the day, the predators moving through corridors they avoid when human traffic is present, the entire ecosystem shifting into a nocturnal configuration that reveals behaviors and patterns that the daytime observers never see. I've been doing this work for 6 years. 6 calving seasons of nights in the Lamar, parked at pullouts along the valley road, scanning the herds through a thermal imaging scope that renders the animals as white shapes against the cooler background of the valley floor, their body heat making them visible at distances of a mile or more. I know the valley's nocturnal rhythms the way a night shift worker knows the rhythms of an empty building, the patterns of movement and stillness that repeat with enough regularity to become predictable, the baseline behavior that tells me when everything is normal and that alerts me when something deviates. May of 2023. A Thursday night, clear, temperatures in the low 30s. The kind of late spring night in the Lamar, when the air is cold enough to see your breath, but the ground is beginning to warm, and the new grass is pushing through the remnants of winter, and the bison are spread across the valley floor, in the loose aggregations that characterize calving season. I was parked at a pullout on the north side of the road, maybe a quarter mile from a herd of approximately 200 bison that were bedded down for the night on a section of the valley floor between the road and the river. Through the thermal scope, they were a constellation of bright shapes against the dark ground, clustered in groups of 20 or 30, the calves pressed close to their mothers, the bulls on the perimeter, the herd arranged in the defensive formation that bison adopt during calving, when the vulnerability of the newborns heightens the vigilance of every adult in the group. I was doing a routine scan of the herd perimeter, checking for wolves or bears that might be positioning for a calf predation attempt, when I noticed the movement. It was on the uphill side of the herd, to the east, where the valley floor began its climb toward the ridge. Something was moving along the edge of the bedded herd, maybe 20 yards from the nearest bison, traveling parallel to the herd's perimeter, with a steady, unhurried pace. I centered the scope on it. Through the thermal imaging, the shape registered as a heat signature, bright against the cooler ground, indicating a warm-blooded organism producing body heat. The shape was taller than a wolf, which was my first assumption, and it was upright. Not momentarily upright the way a bear stands to get a better view or to reach something above its head. Continuously upright, walking on two legs with a smooth, fluid gait that covered ground efficiently, the motion of something that moved bipedally as its natural and preferred mode of locomotion. I watched it through the scope for several minutes, tracking its path along the herd's perimeter. It was walking a circuit, not approaching the herd, not angling toward any individual animal, not exhibiting any predatory behavior that I could identify. It was walking the edge, maintaining a consistent distance of about 20 yards from the nearest bison, moving in a slow loop that would take it around the entire herd if it continued on its current path. I checked the distance. The figure was approximately 400 yards from my position, well within the effective range of the thermal scope, which could resolve detail at over a mile. At 400 yards, the image was clear enough to determine basic morphology, size, posture, and movement pattern. What I could see was a figure that was approximately 6 feet tall, upright, moving on two legs with arms that swung slightly with each step in the natural counter-rotation that accompanies bipedal walking. The proportions were roughly human, but I couldn't determine more detail than that. The thermal image showed a heat signature consistent with a large, warm-blooded organism, but didn't reveal features or clothing or any of the details that would allow positive identification. I considered the obvious explanations: a person, a hiker, or a camper, or someone from the road who had walked out onto the valley floor in the middle of the night to get close to the bison. This happened more often than it should have. Tourists who believed that the darkness provided cover and that the animals couldn't see them in the dark, which was wrong on both counts. But the behavior didn't match. A person approaching a bison herd at night would be erratic, uncertain, moving with the hesitance of someone in unfamiliar terrain. This figure moved with confidence and purpose, following the herd's perimeter with the precision of a route it had walked before, maintaining its distance with a consistency that suggested not caution but routine. And the bison weren't reacting. This was the detail that overrode every rational explanation I could construct. 200 bison, bedded down with newborn calves, in a valley where grizzlies and wolves were actively hunting, were lying calmly while something walked their perimeter at a distance of 20 yards. Bison have extraordinary senses. They can detect a grizzly at half a mile by scent. They can hear a wolf pack coordinating a hunt from a distance that would be inaudible to human ears. A human approaching within 20 yards of a bedded herd during calving season would trigger an immediate response, the bulls rising to their feet, the cows drawing their calves close, the herd contracting into a defensive formation that presents a wall of horns and mass to whatever has tripped their alarm. None of this was happening. The herd was calm. The bulls on the perimeter closest to the walking figure were lying still, their heads up but not alarmed. their body posture showing awareness without concern, the way they might look at a coyote passing at a distance that didn't constitute a threat. They knew the figure was there. They were tracking it the way they tracked everything in their environment, but they weren't afraid. I watched the figure complete one full circuit of the herd. It took approximately 40 minutes, the pace steady, the distance consistent, the route tracing the perimeter of the bedded herd in a loop that brought it past every cluster of animals. When it completed the circuit, it continued, beginning a second loop, following the same path, maintaining the same distance, the same pace, the same unhurried deliberation that looked less like patrolling and more like tending, the way a shepherd walks the perimeter of a flock, not guarding against a specific threat but maintaining a presence that the animals recognize and accept. I reached for the radio and then stopped. What would I report? There's something walking around the bison herd. The dispatcher would ask what it was. I would say I don't know. They would ask me to investigate. I would have to leave my vehicle and walk 400 yards across a dark valley towards something that 200 bison considered normal and that I couldn't identify through a thermal scope that should have told me everything I needed to know. I didn't call it in. I sat in my truck and watched through the scope as the figure completed its second circuit and began a third. The bison remained calm. The calves slept. The bulls watched the figure pass without rising. The valley held its vast nighttime stillness, the river audible in the distance, the stars visible through the windshield, the thermal scope showing me a world of heat signatures in which one signature didn't belong and everything else had accepted it. The figure walked until approximately 4:30 a.m. I watched it for nearly 90 minutes, 3.5 circuits of the herd, the same path, the same pace, the same 20-yard distance. Then, on the fourth circuit, as it reached the uphill side of the herd where I'd first spotted it, it turned and walked away, not toward the road, not toward any trail or pullout or feature that a person would walk toward. Uphill, toward the ridge, moving with the same steady pace into terrain that was steep and pathless, and that at night would be nearly impossible for a human to navigate without a light. No light was visible. The figure walked into the dark hillside, and the thermal signature diminished with distance, and eventually I lost it against the residual heat of the rocks and soil on the ridge face. I sat in the truck until dawn. The sun came up over the Absarokas, and the valley filled with the gray-gold light of early morning, and the bison began to rise, the calves nursing, the adults moving to grazing positions, the herd transitioning from its nighttime defensive formation to its daytime dispersal, with the casual routine of animals beginning another day. I scanned the hillside where the figure had disappeared. Nothing, just sagebrush and rock, and the steep terrain of the valley wall. I've done 3 more calving seasons since that night. I've watched the herds through the thermal scope on dozens of nights, scanning the perimeters, checking for the figure. I've seen it twice more, once in May of 2024, walking the perimeter of a different herd in a different section of the valley, same behavior, same pace, same 20-yard distance, same calm acceptance from the bison. And once in April of 2025, briefly, a thermal signature at the edge of a herd that I caught for maybe 2 minutes before losing it in the terrain. Both times, the bison were calm. Both times, the figure walked the perimeter with the unhurried purpose of something performing a function. Both times, it disappeared uphill, into the ridge, into terrain where I couldn't follow and wouldn't follow if I could. I've told 2 colleagues. One suggested it was a person, a local or a trespasser, who walked among the bison at night for reasons of their own. The other suggested it was a bear walking upright, which bears occasionally do for short distances, but not for the sustained, fluid, 40-minute circuits that I observed. Neither explanation accounts for the bison's reaction, which was no reaction at all, the complete absence of alarm in animals that are genetically programmed to react to predators and humans alike. Something walks with the bison in the Lamar Valley at night, something that the bison know and accept and don't fear. Something that has been walking their perimeter long enough that 200 prey animals with newborn calves consider its presence normal, a fixture of their nocturnal environment, as familiar and as unthreatening as the river or the wind or the mountains that surround them. I don't know what it is. I don't know how long it's been there. I don't know what function it serves or what relationship it has with the animals it walks among. I know that it's bipedal and approximately 6 feet tall, and that it walks with a fluidity that doesn't quite match human locomotion, and that it disappears into terrain that should be impassable in the dark. And I know that the bison trust it. Whatever it is, the bison trust it the way they trust the valley itself, as a feature of their world that has always been there, and that they have no reason to question. And that trust, from animals that trust almost nothing, is the thing that keeps me awake on the nights when the valley is dark and the herds are bedded, and the thermal scope shows me a world of heat signatures in which something walks that shouldn't be walking, and that the animals it walks among have decided, through whatever collective wisdom a bison herd possesses, is not a threat but a presence, a guardian, a watcher, a thing that walks the perimeter in the dark, and that the bison have been living with for longer than anyone, has been watching them with scopes and cameras, and the particular human need to explain everything we see. Some things don't need explaining. Some things just need to be left alone. And the figure walks, every calving season, in the dark, around the herds, and the bison sleep. There are things that happen on the night shift that you don't put in the official report, not because you're hiding anything, not because you're trying to protect yourself, but because the language of official reports wasn't built to hold certain kinds of information. It was built for facts that behave like facts times, coordinates, observable conditions. What happened on the night of November 14th, 2021 did not behave like a fact. It behaved like something older than that, something that didn't particularly care whether I could explain it or not. I was manning the communications desk at the Lake District Ranger Station, which sounds more dramatic than it usually is. Night shift at that desk in November is quiet in the way that only truly empty places can be. Not peaceful, not restful, but hollow. The season was over. The bulk of the park's visitors had gone home weeks earlier, the campgrounds closed, the backcountry permits suspended until spring. Outside the window there was nothing but dark and cold, and the distant sound of the lake moving against its shore, and inside there was me, and the equipment and the low, constant hum of the radio system maintaining its frequencies the way it always did, whether anyone was transmitting or not. I'd been at the desk for about 4 hours when it came through. The thoroughfare station runs on its own designated frequency for scheduled check-ins during the operating season. Every ranger posted out there knows it by heart, because when you're 32 miles from the nearest road and the terrain between you and help is what it is, the radio isn't equipment, it's a lifeline. I'd worked seasonal postings earlier in my career, and I knew that frequency the same way I knew my own phone number. So when the transmission came through, I recognized it immediately. Not a bleed from a neighboring channel, not a bounce from some distant commercial signal. The thoroughfare frequency, clean and direct. The station had been closed for 3 weeks. The seasonal ranger posted there, a woman named Callie, third year at that assignment, had hiked out on October 22nd. I knew because I'd been at the desk when she made her final check-in, her voice cheerful and a little tired, saying she was heading out in the morning and looking forward to a real bed. The station had been winterized after her departure, the building locked, the solar power system shut down according to protocol. In November in that part of the park, it was already receiving snow. The trail between thoroughfare and the nearest trailhead was not a casual route in good conditions. In November, with accumulation on the ground and temperatures dropping the way they do out there, it was not a route that anyone would walk without serious preparation and a serious reason. The transmission lasted maybe 15 seconds. I sat up the moment it registered, reached for my log sheet, and then stopped moving entirely, because the sound coming through the speaker was not what I expected. I expected equipment noise. I expected static shaped into something almost human by distance and interference, the kind of auditory illusion that tired people alone in quiet rooms are susceptible to. I had heard that kind of static before, and I knew what it sounded like, almost words, almost voices, the brain filling in patterns that weren't really there. This was not that. This was a voice, a man's voice, low and unhurried, speaking with complete clarity on a frequency that should have been carrying nothing. The first word was a name. I won't write it here. Even now, I'll call him Warren, which was not what the voice said, but is close enough for the purpose of this account. The voice said the name twice, with a pause between repetitions. The way you say someone's name when you're trying to get their attention. The way you say it when you need them to understand you're serious. Then it said something else. Several words, maybe a full sentence. I couldn't make them out. Not because the signal degraded, the clarity didn't change, but because the words themselves were somehow difficult to resolve, like trying to read text through water. I heard the shape of language without being able to land on meaning. And then the transmission ended, and the frequency returned to its empty hum, and I sat at the desk with my pen above the log sheet and did not move for what was probably 30 seconds, but felt considerably longer. I reported it. I wrote down exactly what I'd heard and the timestamp and the frequency, and I called it in, and I could hear in the response from my supervisor the same careful neutrality that I was trying to maintain in my own voice. Equipment anomaly was the phrase that got used most in the conversation that followed. I agreed that it was probably an equipment anomaly. I agreed that it should be documented and investigated. I agreed with all of it, and I sat at the desk for the rest of my shift, listening to the frequency produce nothing. The helicopter went out the next morning. One of our law enforcement rangers and a park mechanic tasked with inspecting the station and assessing the radio equipment. I was not on that team. I was told the results when they returned. The station was locked. The padlock on the front door was frozen in its hasp and showed no signs of having been opened. The power system was deactivated exactly as it had been left. The solar panel disconnected, the battery bank showing a residual charge, too low to power anything, the radio unit cold to the touch. No footprints in the snow surrounding the building. Not around the door, not around the generator housing, not around the equipment shed. They had flown in after an overnight accumulation of several inches, and the snow around that station was smooth and unbroken in every direction. No sign of entry, no sign that anyone had been within a considerable distance of the building. The mechanic checked the radio unit anyway, documented its condition. Cold, unpowered, incapable of transmission in the state they found it. It was my supervisor who told me the name. Not because he necessarily thought I needed to know, but because he'd been in the Park Service long enough to know that some information wants to be spoken aloud, that keeping it contained doesn't make it smaller. He pulled up the historical records while he was briefing me, and he said it the same way he said everything quietly, without particular emphasis, watching my face while he did. The name the voice had spoken was the name of a ranger who had worked the Thorofar station in the 1970s. He'd been posted there for 3 seasons, a man apparently well suited to the particular demands of that assignment, the isolation, the distance from everything, the way the land out there presses in on you in a way that the more visited sections of the park don't. By all accounts, he'd loved it. He'd put in for the assignment again and again and gotten it, which in those days wasn't difficult, because not everyone was willing to spend a summer 32 miles from the nearest road. He died in October of 1978. An early blizzard, the kind that the park gets some years, fast-moving and severe, that catches the shoulder season by surprise. He'd been hiking out at the end of his posting, the same hike Callie had made in October of 2021, the same trail dozens of rangers had walked before and after him. The search the following spring found him 7 miles from the station, on a section of trail he had walked so many times it should have been automatic, on ground he knew. 7 miles from a place he knew better than almost anywhere. Close enough that on a clear day, from high ground, you could probably still see the drainage he'd come from. I thought about that for a long time afterward. The specificity of it. 7 miles isn't dying lost, it's dying close. Dying in a place you recognize. Dying with the station, probably still visible in your memory, even if the snow had taken your visibility down to nothing. I wondered what that was like. I still wonder. I also think about the name. The fact that I recognized it from the historical records. The fact that it matched a man who had worked that station for 3 seasons and died on the trail out is something that I've tried to approach from every rational angle available to me. Equipment anomaly, auditory apophenia, a tired person alone at night hearing what their brain wanted to hear. I've tried all of those explanations on and none of them quite fits, because I was not tired when it happened, and because the voice was not ambiguous, and because it said the name twice the way you say a name when you need someone to listen. I transferred to a day shift position the following spring. I still work for the Park Service. I still do my job, but I haven't manned a night communications desk since November of 2021, and I don't intend to, and the reason is not that I'm afraid of what I might hear. The reason is that I'm afraid of what it might mean if it transmits again and uses a different name this time, a name I recognize for a different reason, a name that belongs to someone who is supposed to be alive and walking around, someone who hiked out fine at the end of their posting and is currently somewhere warm and unreachable. There are things that happen on the night shift that you don't put in the official report. Sometimes the most honest thing you can say about a night is that the frequency was quiet after that, and you sat with it in the dark, and morning eventually came, and you did not hear the name again. Not yet. People ask me if I got lonely out there, and I always tell them the same thing. Lonely isn't the right word. Lonely implies a lack, an empty space where something familiar should be. What I felt at Thorofar was different from that. It was more like being reminded, very slowly, over the course of weeks, that human beings are a recent and provisional addition to certain landscapes, and that those landscapes have their own texture and rhythm that exist completely independent of whether anyone is present to observe it. That isn't loneliness. It's something closer to humility. Most days, I found it beautiful. I'd applied for the Thorofar posting twice before I got it, and I want to be clear about that because it matters for what comes later. This wasn't an assignment I stumbled into or accepted reluctantly. I wanted it. 32 miles from the nearest road, accessible by horseback or by a multi-day hike through terrain that does not forgive inattention, the most remote manned ranger station in the lower 48 states. A small cabin at the edge of the Thorofar Plateau, a patrol area that takes days to cover properly, and a particular quality of silence that I have not experienced anywhere else before or since. The mountains visible from the porch on clear days are the kind of mountains that make you feel appropriately small. I loved it. I want to be honest about that, because I don't want what happened in September to overwrite everything that came before it, and I'm aware that it threatens to. I arrived in late May and spent the summer doing what the job required: patrol, wildlife monitoring, the occasional interaction with the backcountry permit holders who came through, most of them serious hikers who had earned their way to that part of the park through preparation and commitment. I dealt with bears throughout the summer, which anyone who spent time in Yellowstone's backcountry learns to do not with fear exactly, but with a specific kind of alert respect. Bears are not subtle. They announce themselves with sound and smell, and the particular quality of disruption that large animals produce when they move through an environment. You hear them before you see them. You smell them before you hear them, sometimes. I had a young grizzly investigate the food cache in July, and it was dramatic and ungraceful, and absolutely unambiguous about what it was. The thing that came to the porch in September was none of those things. It started on the third night of the month, a Tuesday, which I know because I kept a journal out there and wrote in it every night before sleep. I'd been in bed for maybe an hour, not asleep yet, listening to the particular silence of the plateau at night, which is not total silence, because wind and water and animals populate it, but which has a baseline quality so different from any sound environment I'd grown up with that it took me weeks in the spring to stop lying awake cataloging it. I was comfortable with it by September. It had become the ambient texture of my sleep. So when the footsteps started, I heard them immediately. They came from the far end of the porch, the north end, away from the door, and they moved south toward the door with a measured, even pace. Not fast, not slow. The pace of someone walking a route they had walked many times, not exploring but transiting, moving from one point to another with the automatic confidence of familiarity. The sound was the sound of weight on old wood, the particular creak and settle of the boards that I knew from my own daily crossings. I knew what my footsteps on that porch sounded like. I had heard them every day for months. This was the same sound. I was out of the bed before I'd made a conscious decision to move. Grabbed the flashlight from the shelf beside the bunk, had my hand on the door latch. The footsteps had reached the south end of the porch, near the door, and stopped. I stood with my hand on the latch for what was probably 5 seconds, and what felt considerably longer, listening to the silence on the other side of the door, and then I opened it. The porch was empty. The meadow beyond it was open and pale in the moonlight, grass moving in a slight wind, nothing standing in it that shouldn't be standing in it. I swept the flashlight across the full arc, north end of the porch, south end, the steps down to the meadow, the tree line 80 yards out. Nothing. No movement, no shape, no eyes catching the light the way animal eyes do. I almost went back inside. I had one hand on the door frame, and I was already constructing the explanation. Old wood settling, some animal on the roof or beneath the porch. The way sounds carry strangely at altitude and cold air. I was already deciding it was nothing. Then I crouched down and put my hand on the porch boards. They were warm. Not residual warmth from the day's sun, which by midnight in September at that elevation was long gone, the wood holding the cold efficiently the way old lumber does. Warm in a specific area, a path of warmth running from the north end of the porch to within a foot of where I was crouching, a strip of boards 2 feet wide in the length of the porch, Warm the way wood gets warm when something has been standing or walking on it, absorbing heat from below, retaining it. Whatever had been walking on my porch had radiated enough warmth that the wood had taken it in and was still holding it minutes later. I did not sleep again that night. I didn't report it that first time. I wrote it in my journal, and I told myself I'd see if it happened again and make a decision from there. I spent the next day examining the porch in daylight, looking for tracks in the soft ground at the base of the steps, looking for disturbance in the meadow grass. The grass near the steps was bent in a way that could have been wind or could have been footfall, and I could not tell which with any certainty. The porch board showed nothing in daylight, just old, weathered wood. It came back the following night. Same time, same direction, same measured pace. North end to south end, soft and deliberate, the sound of someone who knew exactly where they were going. I was out of bed faster this time. Door open within seconds of the footsteps stopping, and again the porch was empty. The meadow was empty, and the boards under my bare feet were warm with borrowed heat that had no source I could stand in front of and identify. I found a system after the first week. I would wait until the footsteps stopped, then open the door and place both hands flat on the boards immediately, mapping the warm area before it dissipated. The warmth was consistent, always the same path, always the same width, always fading from the south end first as if whatever made it had been longer at the north end before beginning its transit. I started timing how long the warmth lasted. 7 minutes, consistently. 7 minutes of retained heat in wood that the September night should have kept cold, and then gone, and the boards back to the temperature of the air, and the porch just a porch again. I called in a report in the second week. I used careful language, the language of someone filing an anomalous observation rather than a frightened account. I mentioned the sounds, the timing, the absence of any visible source. I mentioned the warmth in the boards. The response was professional and measured a suggestion that it was likely bear activity, a recommendation to set up a camera to document. I set up the camera. I positioned it to cover the full length of the porch with a motion-activated trigger. I told myself I would have an answer by morning. The camera triggered 17 times over the following 3 nights. Every trigger corresponded with the footsteps. Every image was the same. The porch, empty. The meadow behind it, empty. The night holding nothing that the camera could resolve into a shape or a source. 17 images of an empty porch from which warmth radiated when I checked it immediately after each trigger. I finished my posting. I hiked out at the end of October with my journals and my gear and the camera's memory card, and I did not look back at the station when I reached the first rise that would have let me, though I am aware that I made a deliberate decision not to. I've thought about it constantly since. Not with the urgency of those September nights, but with the persistent, low-frequency quality of something that hasn't resolved. I looked up the station's history after I got back. There was nothing remarkable in the official records, nothing that would explain a presence, a pattern, a warmth that returned every night for 3 weeks, with the consistency of something that had been doing it for a long time. But I remembered the communications report I'd heard about secondhand, the one about the transmission that had come through from the closed station the previous November, the voice that said a name, the name of the ranger who died on the trail in 1978, 7 miles from the station, on ground he had crossed so many times it should have been automatic. He'd walked that porch every day for 3 seasons, back and forth, north end to south end, checking the meadow, watching the mountains, doing what you do when you live somewhere long enough that the routines become part of you. I think about that when I remember the footsteps, the particular quality of that pace, not searching, not cautious, but familiar. The walk of someone crossing ground they know well, from one end to the other and back again, occupying a space they consider, in some way the living cannot fully comprehend, still theirs. The porch was always warm when I checked. I don't know what to do with that. I don't know that there is anything to do with it, but I have not applied for the thoroughfare posting again, and when people ask me why, I tell them I'm ready for something different. That's easier than the truth, which is that I'm not sure the station is as empty as the official records suggest, and I'm not sure I'm prepared to spend another September finding out. I've been a backcountry ranger in Yellowstone for 11 years, which means I've spent the better part of my career in the park's interior, the vast, roadless wilderness that most visitors never see, and that operates on rules that the boardwalked, signposted, visitor-centered front country doesn't prepare you for. The backcountry of Yellowstone is not the Yellowstone of the brochures. It's 2 million acres of terrain that is as wild as anything left in the lower 48 states. A landscape where grizzly bears outnumber humans on most days, and where the thermal features and the weather and the sheer scale of the wilderness create conditions that demand constant attention and a particular kind of humility. The understanding that you are not the dominant species here, and that the landscape does not care about your schedule or your comfort or your survival. The Pelican Valley is the heart of this wildness. A broad, marshy valley in the park's interior, drained by Pelican Creek, surrounded by ridges covered in lodgepole pine, and containing some of the highest grizzly bear density in the lower 48. Human access is restricted. You can't enter the valley before 9 a.m. or remain after 7 p.m., and overnight camping is prohibited. The restrictions exist because the valley is a critical feeding area for grizzlies, particularly in late summer and fall when the bears are in hyperphagia, the frantic pre-hibernation feeding period when a grizzly can consume 20,000 calories a day and doesn't appreciate being interrupted. I patrol the valley on horseback, checking for permit compliance and monitoring wildlife activity, riding through meadows and along creek bottoms where the bears graze on clover and dig for pocket gophers, and go about the business of getting fat enough to survive winter. August of 2022. I was leading a patrol of 3 riders through the valley, myself and 2 seasonal rangers who were learning the backcountry patrol routes. We'd entered the valley from the east, following the trail that crosses Pelican Creek and then turns south through a series of meadows that open up between the creek and the ridgeline. The morning had been routine, a few grizzly sightings at comfortable distances, a group of hikers who were compliant with their permit, the usual summer traffic of a restricted area that people visit specifically because it's restricted and therefore feels more wild than the front country. We were riding single file through a meadow near the creek, maybe 2 miles into the valley, when my horse stopped. His name was Dutch, a 12-year-old quarter horse that I'd been riding for 6 seasons, an animal so reliable and so experienced in the backcountry that I trusted his judgment about terrain and wildlife almost more than I trusted my own. Dutch didn't spook. In 6 years of riding him through bear country and thermal areas and across rivers and through everything else that Yellowstone's backcountry produces, I'd never seen him spook. He was the kind of horse that other rangers requested because his steadiness in difficult situations was legendary. Dutch stopped, not spooked, not balking, not shying away from a scent or a sound. He planted his feet and refused to move and stared across the meadow to the south with an intensity that I'd never seen from him. His ears locked forward, his body rigid, every muscle tensed with the particular alertness of an animal that has detected something that its experience cannot categorize. I followed his gaze. The meadow extended south for maybe 400 yards before the tree line began, a broad expanse of grass and sedge and wildflowers that was typical of the Pelican Valley's summer meadows. At first I saw nothing unusual, the meadow, the trees, the ridge beyond. Then my eyes found them, elk, a group of approximately 30, standing in the meadow about 300 yards from our position. This wasn't unusual by itself. Elk are common in the Pelican Valley in summer, cows and calves using the meadows for grazing and the creek for water. What was unusual was their arrangement. They were standing in a circle, a perfect circle, geometrically precise. The 30 animals arranged equidistant from each other, around a perimeter that was maybe 40 yards in diameter. Their bodies were oriented inward, all of them facing the center of the formation, their heads lowered, their posture showing the particular stillness of animals that are not grazing and not resting, and not alert to a threat but that are engaged in something, attending to something, focused on the empty space at the center of their circle, with a collective attention that I had never seen in 11 years of observing wildlife behavior. They were motionless, 30 large animals, cows weighing 400 to 500 pounds each, standing in geometric perfection in the middle of an August meadow without moving, not shifting their weight, not flicking their ears, not turning their heads, standing with a stillness that was unnatural for animals of any kind, the kind of absolute immobility that suggests not rest but concentration, the physical manifestation of attention so complete that it suppresses all involuntary movement. I raised my binoculars and looked at the circle more carefully. The spacing between animals was remarkably consistent, maybe 4 feet between each elk, the gap maintained with a precision that would have required measurement if humans had arranged it. The circle's geometry was perfect enough that I could see it as a shape, not just a group of animals, but a deliberate formation, a ring of living bodies arranged around a center point with the intentionality of a ceremony or a ritual or some other purposeful gathering that I had no framework for understanding in the context of wild elk in a Yellowstone meadow. The center of the circle was empty, just grass, the same meadow grass that grew everywhere else, showing no feature, no object, no difference from the surrounding terrain that I could detect through binoculars at 300 yards. Whatever the elk were focused on, it wasn't visible to me. I looked at Dutch. He was still planted, still staring, his body rigid. I checked the two horses behind me. Both had stopped. Both were staring at the circle with the same fixed attention that Dutch was showing, their ears forward, their bodies tense. 3 experienced backcountry horses, animals that had been through everything the park could throw at them, were refusing to approach a group of elk standing in a meadow. The horses knew something. Horses always know something. They operate on senses that we share but don't fully access, detecting vibrations and electromagnetic fields and chemical signals that the human nervous system processes below the threshold of consciousness. Whatever the horses were sensing from the direction of that circle was enough to override their training and their trust in their riders, and to produce a refusal that no amount of leg pressure or rain cue was going to overcome. We sat there for approximately 10 minutes, 3 riders on 3 horses, watching 30 elk stand in a perfect circle in a meadow in the Pelican Valley, none of us speaking, all of us aware that what we were seeing didn't fit inside any behavioral model we'd been taught. The 2 seasonal rangers behind me were experienced outdoors people, both biology graduates, both familiar with elk behavior, and neither of them said a word. The silence among us was the silence of people who are witnessing something that they can't explain, and who know that speaking about it will require committing to the reality of it, and committing to the reality of it will require accommodating it in a worldview that doesn't currently have room for it. The circle broke at approximately 2:15 p.m., not gradually, not with individual animals peeling off or losing formation. All at once, simultaneously, 30 elk moving at the same instant, stepping out of the circle and walking away in different directions with the casual, unhurried gait of animals resuming normal activity after a pause. Not alarmed, not hurried. The transition from ceremonial stillness to ordinary behavior was instantaneous and complete, as if whatever had held them in formation had released them all at the same moment, and they had returned to being elk, grazing and walking and doing the things that elk do in a summer meadow. The circle dissolving into a loose scatter of animals that bore no visible trace of the geometric precision they'd exhibited moments before. I rode to the center of the circle. Dutch went reluctantly, his pace slow, his head high, his ears swiveling with the vigilance of an animal entering space that it doesn't trust. The 2 horses behind followed at an increased distance, their riders giving them rein to maintain whatever gap the horses felt they needed. The center of the circle showed what I expected, and nothing more. Trampled grass, compressed by the hooves of 30 elk standing in a ring, the vegetation pushed flat in a circular pattern that would be visible from above as a crop circle of sorts, a ring of trampled meadow grass with an undisturbed center. I dismounted and walked the center on foot. The grass was uncompressed. Nothing had been standing or lying in the middle of the circle. No scat, no urine, no secretion, no mineral deposit, no thermal feature, no object of any kind. The elk had been standing around nothing, or around something that I couldn't detect with the senses available to me, something that was present to the elk and to the horses but not to the human who rode among them. The ground was warm, not dramatically, not the obvious heat of a thermal feature, but when I knelt and pressed my palm to the grass at the center of the circle, the earth beneath was warmer than the surrounding meadow by maybe 10 degrees, a subtle differential that could have been caused by the sun's position or by the compressed grass retaining heat differently, or by a dozen other explanations that I constructed and tested and found insufficient. I stood in the center of where the circle had been, and I looked at the meadow around me, and the elk grazing peacefully in the distance, and the horses waiting with their riders on the trail, and the mountains rising on every side holding the valley in its ancient shape. Nothing was wrong. The meadow was a meadow. The elk were elk. The day was an August day in Yellowstone, warm and bright. The sky blue above the ridgeline, but the horses wouldn't cross the circle. When I remounted and we continued our patrol, Dutch detoured around the trampled area, adding 50 yards to our route rather than walking through the compressed grass. The other 2 horses followed his lead without being directed. 3 experienced backcountry horses, refusing to walk on ground where 30 elk had stood in a formation that no one could explain. I filed a wildlife observation report, unusual elk behavior, Pelican Valley, date and time, and GPS coordinates. I described the formation in neutral language. Circle pattern, approximately 30 animals, stationary for 10+ minutes, disbanded simultaneously. I did not describe the geometry's precision. I did not mention the horse's refusal. I did not note the warm ground at the center. The report entered the system and was filed, and as far as I know, nobody followed up on it, because elk standing in a meadow isn't a management concern regardless of the pattern they're standing in. I've told a few people. The responses range from interested skepticism to the particular silence that people produce when they've seen something similar and don't want to talk about it. One researcher, a wildlife biologist who'd spent 20 years studying elk behavior in the park, listened to my description and then said something that I think about often. She said that elk behavior in Yellowstone is some of the most studied animal behavior in the world, that researchers have spent decades documenting every aspect of their ecology and their social structure and their movement patterns, and that in all of that research, nobody has documented what I described because nobody has been in the right place at the right time to see it, or because the elk don't do it when researchers are present, or because the people who have seen it have chosen, as I almost chose, not to describe it in official reports, because the observation doesn't fit inside the models we've built to understand what elk are and what elk do. She said the models are incomplete. She said all models are incomplete. She said the animals we think we understand are doing things we haven't observed yet, and that the things we haven't observed aren't anomalies, but aspects of behavior that our presence normally suppresses, and that emerge only in the moments when the animals believe they're unobserved. The elk stood in a circle. 30 animals, arranged in geometric perfection, facing inward, motionless, focused on a center point that held nothing visible, but that held the attention of every animal in the formation, and that the horses refused to cross, and that was warm to the touch when everything around it was cool. I don't know what they were doing. I don't know why they chose that spot in that meadow on that afternoon. I don't know what was at the center of their circle that I couldn't see, and that the horses could sense, and that the elk attended to with a collective focus that bordered on devotion. I know they stood in a circle. I know the circle was perfect. I know they broke simultaneously. I know the center was warm. And I know the horses knew something I didn't. And I think the elk knew something the horses didn't. And whatever it was, whatever drew 30 wild animals into a ceremonial ring in the middle of the most studied wildlife area in the Western Hemisphere, it happened in broad daylight, in a meadow that thousands of visitors walk through every summer, on ground that we think we understand, because we've mapped it and measured it and built models of the ecosystem that sits on it. The models don't include circles. The models don't account for formations. The models don't explain warm ground at the center of a ring of motionless elk or horses that won't cross the trampled grass. But the elk know. They stood in that circle for a reason. They faced inward for a reason. They attended to the center for a reason. And then they walked away, and the meadow was a meadow again, and the day continued as if nothing had happened. But the grass stayed trampled, and the ground stayed warm, and the horses remembered, and so do I. The Beckler region of Yellowstone is the park's forgotten corner, the southwest section that most visitors don't know exists, and that even experienced park employees sometimes go years without visiting. It's accessed from the Idaho side, through a ranger station that sits at the end of a gravel road near the tiny community of Cave Falls, and the backcountry beyond the trailhead is as remote as anything in the lower 48, a landscape of river corridors and waterfalls and thermal areas that are hours from the nearest road, and that in October, when the season is ending and the snow is coming, feel like they exist outside the boundaries of the inhabited world. I've been a backcountry ranger in Yellowstone for 8 years, and the Beckler has been part of my patrol territory for the last 4. The work in October is mostly administrative, doing end-of-season checks on trail conditions, removing bear management signs, closing backcountry campsites for the winter, the housekeeping tasks that prepare the park's interior for the months of snow and isolation that will follow. The patrols are solitary. In October, the seasonal staff has gone home and the backcountry rangers who remain are spread thin across the park's 2 million acres, each of us covering territory that would normally be shared among several people. I don't mind the solitude. The backcountry in October is beautiful in a way that summer doesn't allow. The crowd's gone, the aspens turning gold, the first snow dusting the higher elevations, the landscape settling into the quiet that precedes winter. The 14th of October 2021. I entered the Beckler River Trail from the ranger station around 7 in the morning, planning to hike about 12 miles to a backcountry campsite that needed closing, then return the same way the following day. The morning was cold, mid-20s, frost on the meadow grass, the sky clear with the particular blue intensity that October produces at elevation. The trail followed the Beckler River through a corridor of lodgepole pine and meadow, the terrain relatively flat for Yellowstone, the river audible to my left as it moved through its wide marshy valley. I'd been hiking for about 4 hours and had covered maybe 8 miles when I saw the figure. The trail ahead of me ran straight for several hundred yards through a section of burned lodgepole, the standing dead trees creating a lattice of gray trunks that broke the sightline into fragments, but that allowed intermittent visibility for a considerable distance. Through this lattice, maybe a quarter mile ahead, I could see a shape on the trail. A person apparently upright and moving in the same direction I was traveling, walking the trail at a pace that appeared unhurried. I wasn't surprised. Late-season hikers weren't common in the Beckler, but they weren't unheard of, and my job included checking backcountry permits, which meant I needed to catch up and verify that whoever was ahead of me was authorized to be there. I increased my pace from the comfortable 3 miles per hour that I normally maintained to something closer to 4, a pace that should have closed the gap between us at a rate of about a mile per hour. At that rate, I should have caught the figure in 15 minutes. After 15 minutes, the figure was still a quarter mile ahead. I'd been walking faster, but the distance hadn't changed. The figure was visible through the burned trees, moving at what appeared to be the same unhurried pace, but somehow maintaining the exact same gap that had separated us when I'd first spotted it. I walked faster, nearly jogging now, pushing close to 5 miles per hour, a pace that is difficult to maintain with a pack on uneven terrain. The figure maintained its distance. The quarter-mile gap held with a precision that was beginning to register, not as coincidence but as intention. The figure matching my speed changes instantaneously, accelerating when I accelerated, maintaining the gap with the mechanical consistency of a shadow. I stopped. The figure stopped. Not gradually, not with the momentum that a walking person carries for a step or two after deciding to halt. Immediately, I stopped and the figure stopped, simultaneously, as if we were connected by a rigid bar that transmitted my movement to it without delay. The dead trees between us stood in their gray columns, and the trail was visible in segments between the trunks, and the figure was there, a quarter mile away, standing still on the trail, facing the same direction it had been walking, not turning to look back at me, not adjusting its position, just standing with the same motionless patience that it had demonstrated in motion, as if walking and standing were equivalent states, and the transition between them required no preparation or adjustment. I pulled my binoculars from my chest harness and raised them to my eyes and focused on the figure. The distance was at the edge of what the binoculars could resolve in the broken sight line of the dead forest. What I could see was a shape that was approximately human in outline, upright, bipedal proportions, approximately 6 feet tall based on its height relative to the lodgepole trunks it stood among. It appeared to be wearing dark clothing, or its surface was dark, the color uniform from head to foot with no visible differentiation between upper and lower body. No pack was visible, no hat, no bright colors that would suggest standard hiking gear. The figure was a dark, human-shaped form standing on a trail in a dead forest, and through the binoculars at a quarter mile through standing dead trees, I could not make it more specific than that. I started walking again. The figure started walking. The synchronization was perfect, zero delay between my first step and its first step, the motion beginning simultaneously as if triggered by the same signal. I walked at a normal pace. The figure walked at whatever pace maintained the quarter-mile gap. I sped up. It sped up. I slowed to a crawl. It slowed to a crawl. Every change in my pace was matched instantly, the distance between us as fixed as if it were measured and enforced by something more precise than human perception. I tried something. I walked backward, taking steps in reverse, moving away from the figure while facing it. Through the binoculars I watched, the figure walked backward too, not turning around and walking the other direction, but walking backward, moving in reverse on the trail with the same smooth gait it had been using moving forward, matching my retreat step for step, maintaining the gap. I felt the first real spike of fear at that moment, the physiological response of a body that has processed information faster than the conscious mind and has arrived at a conclusion that the conscious mind is still trying to avoid. Whatever was on the trail ahead of me was not a hiker, was not a person in any ordinary sense, was something that was responding to my movement with a precision and a synchronization that no human could achieve. At a quarter mile through intermittent sight lines, something that was mimicking the form and the motion of a person on a trail, with an accuracy that was close enough to pass at a distance and wrong enough to terrify at close examination. I continued forward, not because I wanted to approach it, but because forward was the direction of the trailhead, and because the alternative was turning around and adding 8 miles to my return through a section of backcountry that would be in full darkness. By the time I reached the ranger station, I walked with the binoculars raised, watching the figure maintain its distance, watching it move through the dead lodgepole, with the fluid gait that never varied, never stumbled, never showed the small adjustments that a real human makes when walking on uneven ground. The weight shifts and the arm corrections and the micro movements that keep a bipedal organism balanced on terrain that is never perfectly flat. The figure moved without adjustment. Its gait was smooth and continuous, the same cadence on uphill sections as on flat ground. No change in pace for the roots and rocks that the trail surface presented, no visible response to the terrain beneath its feet. It moved the way a projected image moves, the way a shadow moves, without friction, without effort, without the physical consequences that gravity and surface and mass impose on bodies that are actually there. The trail curved. I'd been watching the figure for maybe 2 miles, 40 minutes of matched pace and fixed distance through the burned forest, when the trail turned to the left and entered a section of live timber where the trees were dense and the sightline shortened dramatically. I came around the curve, and the trail ahead was visible for maybe 100 yards before the next bend. Empty. The trail was empty. No figure, no shape, no dark form walking the path. The trail extended through the live forest, the surface showing my own boot prints arriving from behind me, and nothing else. No prints ahead, none. The soft, October damp surface of a trail that shows every track clearly showed only my tracks approaching the curve and nothing beyond. I walked the next 100 yards slowly, watching the ground. The trail surface was undisturbed. No boot prints, no depressions, no marks of any kind that would indicate a person had walked this section of trail, not just recently, but at all. No old prints, no scuffed surfaces, no evidence that any human foot had contacted this part of the trail in days or weeks. Whatever I'd been watching for 2 miles and 40 minutes had not been walking on the trail in any physical sense. It had been visible on the trail, moving along the trail, matching my pace on the trail, but it had not been touching the trail, had not been leaving the marks that physical objects leave when they contact physical surfaces, had not been present in the way that presence is normally understood. I completed my patrol. I reached the campsite, closed it for the season, and hiked back the following day. The return hike was uneventful. The section of burned lodgepole where I'd seen the figure was empty and quiet, the dead trees standing in their gray rows, the trail running through them undisturbed, the sightlines showing nothing for a quarter mile in every direction. I filed a trip report, trail conditions, campsite status, wildlife observations. I did not mention the figure, not because I doubted what I'd seen, but because what I'd seen didn't fit inside the categories that trip reports accommodate, and because describing it would have required language that I didn't have, and conclusions that I couldn't support, and a willingness to be the ranger, who reports seeing things on empty trails that I wasn't sure I possessed. I've hiked the Beckler River Trail several times since, in daylight, in company, in the busy months when other hikers are present and the trail feels like a trail rather than a corridor, through a landscape that holds things it doesn't show you until you're alone. I've never seen the figure again, but I check the trail ahead more carefully now. I scan the sight lines through the trees with an attention that goes beyond professional vigilance into something more personal, looking for the dark shape that matches my pace and maintains its distance, and stops when I stop and walks when I walk, and that mimics the form of a person on a trail well enough to fool you at a quarter mile, but that leaves no prints and makes no sound, and that disappears around curves into trails. that show no evidence it was ever there. Something was on that trail. Something that responded to my movement with a precision that was not human, and that occupied a space on the trail without physically contacting it, and that maintained a distance that felt less like coincidence and more like a boundary, a fixed gap that it enforced, because the gap was the point, the distance at which it could be seen and not identified, observed and not understood, a quarter mile, close enough to see, too far to know, and I wonder if it's still there. On that trail, in that burned forest, maintaining its quarter-mile gap from whatever ranger or hiker walks the Beckler River corridor in the late season, when the park is empty and the trails are quiet, and the things that use those trails when nobody is watching have the space to be what they are. Walking when you walk, stopping when you stop, keeping pace, keeping distance, keeping the particular patience of something that has been on that trail longer than the trail has existed, and leaving no prints. I've worked maintenance at the Old Faithful complex in Yellowstone National Park for 12 years, which is long enough to have developed a relationship with the geyser basin that most people would find difficult to understand. The basin is the park's most famous feature, the broad, flat expanse of thermal ground where Old Faithful and dozens of other geysers and hot springs perform their eruptions for the millions of visitors who come each year to watch water shoot out of the earth on a roughly predictable schedule. During the day, the basin is a spectacle, crowded and noisy, and alive with the particular energy of thousands of people experiencing something they've never seen before. The boardwalks packed, the benches around Old Faithful full, cameras clicking every time the geyser goes off with the reliable punctuality that made it famous. At night, the basin is a different world. The visitors go to their rooms at the inn or the lodge or drive back to their campgrounds or their hotels in West Yellowstone, and the basin empties out and becomes what it was before the boardwalks and the buildings and the parking lots, a thermal landscape, doing what thermal landscapes do without anyone watching. The geysers still erupt, Old Faithful going off every 90 minutes to an audience of steam and darkness. The hot springs still steam, their pale blue pools sending columns of vapor into the cold air that the lights from the buildings illuminate into a fog that transforms the basin into something alien, a landscape of white mist rising from dark ground, the boardwalks appearing and disappearing in the vapor, the sulfur smell thick and mineral and warm. My job puts me in this landscape after hours. Maintenance at the complex runs around the clock because the infrastructure, the plumbing and the heating and the electrical systems that serve the inn and the lodge, doesn't stop needing attention when the visitors go to bed. My shift rotates, but in the winter months I'm often on the night schedule, working from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., handling whatever comes up, a broken pipe, a heating failure, an electrical issue that needs attention before morning. The work sometimes takes me onto the boardwalk, either to access utility infrastructure that runs beneath it or to check on the thermal monitoring equipment that the geology team maintains at various points in the basin. I'm comfortable in the basin at night. That's important to say because what I'm about to describe needs to be understood in the context of familiarity, not novelty. I'm not a visitor experiencing the basin after dark for the first time and being spooked by the unfamiliar sounds and the fog and the sulfur and the general otherworldliness of a place where the earth vents its internal heat through cracks in its surface. I know what the basin sounds like at night. I know the hissing of steam vents and the gurgling of hot springs and the occasional violent rush of a geyser erupting in the dark. I know the creaking of the boardwalk as the wood expands and contracts with temperature changes. I know the sound of thermal water moving through channels beneath the surface, the plumbing of the geyser basin conducting its business with the mechanical regularity of a system that has been operating for thousands of years. November of 2020. A Thursday night, cold, the temperature in the single digits, the basin producing more steam than usual, because the differential between the hot water and the cold air was extreme enough to generate visible vapor from features that barely steamed in summer. I was on the boardwalk near Old Faithful, heading to a monitoring station about a quarter mile from the inn, carrying a tool bag and a flashlight, walking at the unhurried pace of someone who knows the route and doesn't need to rush. The tapping started about 200 yards from the inn. I was on the boardwalk, the wooden planks solid beneath my boots, the boardwalk elevated about 3 feet above the thermal ground on concrete piers, the standard construction that keeps visitors above the fragile and dangerous thermal surface while allowing them to walk through the basin. Below the boardwalk, The ground was mineral-encrusted silica sinter, the pale crust that forms when thermal water deposits dissolved silica on the surface, creating the distinctive white and gray landscape that characterizes the geyser basins. The tapping came from beneath the boardwalk, not from beside it, not from the steam vents or the hot springs that surrounded the walkway on both sides. From directly below the planks, from the thermal ground beneath my feet, it was metallic, sharp, regular, the sound of something hard, striking something hard in a rhythm that was too even and too precise to be geological. Thermal areas produce sounds constantly, hissing and bubbling, and the occasional crack of rock shifting under thermal stress. But those sounds are irregular, governed by the chaotic dynamics of heat and pressure and water, never repeating with the mechanical regularity that this tapping exhibited. I stopped walking. The tapping stopped. The synchronization was immediate, the sound ceasing the instant my feet stopped moving on the boardwalk, the way a noise stops when the mechanism that produces it is deactivated. The basin's normal sounds continued, the hissing and the gurgling and the distant rush of a geyser erupting somewhere in the fog. But the tapping was gone. I started walking again. The tapping resumed. Beneath my feet, directly below whatever plank I was standing on, the sharp metallic rhythm matching my pace, one tap for each step, maintaining a synchronization that was too precise to be coincidental. I walked faster. The tapping accelerated. I walked slower. It decelerated. I took 2 quick steps and then paused. The tapping produced 2 quick taps and then silence. I was being matched. Something beneath the boardwalk was producing sounds that corresponded to my movement with a precision that required awareness of my position and my pace and the ability to generate the tapping in real time in response to what I was doing. Not an echo, because the sound didn't follow my footsteps but accompanied them, simultaneous rather than delayed. Not a reflection or a resonance, because the rhythm matched my varying pace rather than following its own pattern. Something beneath the thermal ground beneath the boardwalk was tracking me and responding. I knelt on the boardwalk and pressed my ear to the planks. The wood was warm, heated by the thermal ground below, and against my ear, I could hear the tapping with a clarity that removed any remaining possibility of misidentification. It was close, directly beneath the boardwalk surface, maybe 2 or 3 feet below the planks. In the thermal ground or in a void within the thermal ground, something was producing the sound with the deliberate regularity of a mechanism or an organism that had decided to make this particular noise at this particular time in response to this particular stimulus. With the tapping pressed against the wood, I could feel a vibration, not the thermal vibration of heated ground, which is a low, continuous, undifferentiated tremor. This was rhythmic, a pulse that came with each tap, a vibration that was discrete and repeating, and that felt, against my cheek and my palms, less like a geological process and more like a communication, a series of impacts produced by something that intended to produce them. I stood up and walked. The tapping followed. I walked the remaining distance to the monitoring station, maybe 300 yards, and the tapping accompanied me for every step, directly below me, matching my pace, maintaining its position beneath my feet with the precision of something that knew exactly where I was on the boardwalk above it and that could track my movement through the planks. When I stepped off the boardwalk onto the asphalt pad where the monitoring station was located, the tapping stopped. Immediately, completely, as if the boundary between boardwalk and asphalt were a line that the sound would not or could not cross. I stood on the asphalt and listened. The basin produced its normal nighttime sounds. No tapping. I stepped back onto the boardwalk. The tapping resumed beneath my foot. I did my work at the monitoring station, and then I walked back to the inn on the boardwalk, and the tapping followed me the entire way. A quarter mile of sharp metallic rhythm, tracking my progress from beneath the planks, stopping when I stopped, starting when I started, maintaining its position directly below my feet with an accuracy that suggested not pursuit but accompaniment, not tracking but walking with, as if something beneath the thermal ground had decided to keep me company on my walk through the basin and was expressing that decision in the only way available to it, through the medium of the boardwalk that separated us. I've heard it since, not every night, maybe once a month, on the nights when I'm on the boardwalk alone after dark, the tapping rising from beneath the planks with the same metallic regularity and the same responsive synchronization. It always follows my pace. It always stays directly below me. It always stops when I step off the boardwalk and starts when I step back on. I've told a few colleagues. One of them, a maintenance worker who's been at Old Faithful longer than I have, listened to my description and nodded and said he'd heard it too. He said he'd been hearing it for years. He said he didn't talk about it because there was nothing to say, that the tapping was a feature of the basin the way the geysers were a feature, something that the thermal ground produced under certain conditions for reasons that nobody understood and that didn't respond to investigation. I asked him what he thought it was. He said the basin was a thin place. He used that phrase, thin place, and when I asked him what he meant, he said the thermal ground in the geyser basin was a few feet of rock and mineral crust over a system of superheated water and steam that extended down to a magma chamber that was one of the largest active volcanic systems on the planet. He said the ground I walked on every night was a skin stretched over something immense and hot and alive in the geological sense, and that the tapping was the sound of that something responding to pressure on its surface the way a drum responds to a hand striking its head. I don't think that's what it is. A drum doesn't match your pace. A drum doesn't stop when you stop. A drum doesn't track your position along a quarter-mile of boardwalk with the precision of something that is aware of you and that is choosing to respond. Something is beneath the boardwalk at Old Faithful. Something that exists in the thermal ground or in the voids within the thermal ground, in the spaces where superheated water and steam create channels and chambers in the silica crust, spaces that are too hot and too acidic for any known organism, but that are not empty, that hold something that listens for footsteps on the boardwalk above, and that responds with a tapping that is too regular to be geological, and too responsive to be mechanical, and too precise to be anything except deliberate. I still work the night shift. I still walk the boardwalk. The tapping still comes, on the nights when it comes, rising from the thin ground beneath the planks, following me through the steam and the sulfur and the fog-shrouded darkness of a basin that is the surface expression of something vast and hot and ancient beneath the park. And I walk, and it taps, and we move together through the basin at midnight, the maintenance worker and the thing beneath the boardwalk, separated by 3 feet of wood and sinter, and the thin crust of a planet that is alive beneath its surface in ways that we measure with instruments but understand with instinct. Something is down there. It hears me walk. It responds. And on the coldest, foggiest nights, when the steam is thick enough to erase the world and the boardwalk is a path through nothing, and the only sounds are my boots and the tapping that follows them, I think it's not responding to my footsteps at all. I think it's knocking. From below. The way you knock on a door, the way you knock on a ceiling, the way something trapped beneath a surface knocks to let the people above know it's there. And every time I walk the boardwalk, I'm walking on the door, and something beneath it wants me to know that the door is thinner than I think. I've been studying wolf behavior in Yellowstone's northern range for 15 years, first as a graduate student and then as a researcher with the park's Wolf Project, spending my winters in the Lamar Valley and the surrounding terrain, observing the packs that have recolonized the park since the 1995 reintroduction. The work is patient and cold and often monotonous. Hours spent behind a spotting scope on a frozen ridge, watching wolves do what wolves mostly do, which is sleep. People who romanticize wolf research don't understand that wolves spend the majority of their time resting, conserving energy for the hunts that punctuate days of inactivity, with bursts of explosive violence. The dramatic moments, the hunts and the kills and the territorial conflicts represent maybe 5% of a wolf's daily activity. The other 95% is waiting and sleeping and the slow social maintenance that holds a pack together, the grooming and the play and the subtle dominance interactions that establish and reinforce the hierarchy. I know these animals, not just as a population or a species, but as individuals, each wolf identifiable by its markings and its behavior and its position in the social structure of its pack. I've watched wolves be born and grow up and find mates and establish territories and raise pups and die. I've seen the full spectrum of wolf behavior, from the coordinated precision of a hunt to the tender attentiveness of a mother nursing her pups in the den, to the savage territorial aggression that erupts when packs meet at their boundaries. In 15 years, I've observed more wolf behavior than most researchers see in a career, and the data I've collected has contributed to the most comprehensive behavioral study of wild wolves ever conducted. I thought I'd seen everything wolves could do, until January of 2023. The Junction Butte pack was one of the most studied packs in the park, named for the geographic feature at the center of their territory, a group that had been continuously monitored since their formation in 2012. In January of 2023, the pack numbered 11, a healthy count that included the alpha pair, several subordinate adults, and 2 yearlings from the previous spring's litter. They were using the Lamar Valley as their winter territory, which was typical. The valley's open terrain and abundant elk herds providing the hunting opportunities that wolves need to survive the winter. I was observing from a ridge on the north side of the valley, a position I'd used hundreds of times, elevated enough to see the valley floor for several miles in each direction, sheltered from the wind by a rock outcrop that made the sub-zero temperatures manageable. The pack was bedded in a section of the valley, about a mile west of my position. The 11 wolves visible through my spotting scope as gray and black shapes on the snow, resting in the loose aggregation that they typically use during the day. The adults sleeping while the yearlings engaged in the low-level play that young wolves use to pass the time between hunts. The time was approximately 2:30 inches the afternoon. The light was flat, the gray January light of the Lamar Valley, when the sun is low and the shadows are long, and the snow surface is bright enough to make you squint even through the scope's filters. The valley was quiet. No elk visible in the immediate area, no other predators, no human activity. Standard January conditions for the northern range. I was watching the yearlings play, documenting the interaction in my field notes, when the alpha female stood up. This caught my attention because the alpha female's movements often signal a pack activity, a hunt initiation, or a territorial patrol, and her body language in the moments before she moves can tell you what's coming. She stood up from her resting position, and her body language was wrong. Not the controlled, purposeful rise of a wolf preparing to hunt or patrol. She lurched to her feet with the sudden, uncoordinated motion of an animal reacting to a stimulus that has bypassed the normal behavioral sequence, the deliberate chain of attention and assessment and decision that precedes voluntary action. She'd been startled, or more than startled. She'd been frightened. The rest of the pack responded within seconds, not to her movement but to whatever she'd responded to. All 11 wolves, rising simultaneously with the same startled urgency, the same bypassing of normal behavioral sequence, the entire pack going from resting to standing in a unified lurch that said they'd all detected the same stimulus at the same moment, and that the stimulus was severe enough to trigger an immediate response. And then they ran. In 15 years of wolf research, I have never seen a pack run like this. Wolves run in different ways for different purposes. The hunting run is coordinated and directional, the pack spreading into formation, the fastest wolves pushing ahead, the slower ones flanking, the group operating as a unit with a shared objective. The territorial run is aggressive and performative, wolves running toward a threat with raised hackles and stiff posture, advertising their willingness to fight. The play run of young wolves is exuberant and disorganized, animals sprinting and changing direction and tumbling over each other. This was none of those. This was panic. Pure, absolute, undifferentiated panic, the kind of running that an animal does when it believes it is about to die. All 11 wolves, from the alpha pair to the yearlings, running in a tight group, shoulder to shoulder, heading east across the valley floor at full speed, a sprint that wolves can sustain for short distances, and that they reserve for the final closing rush of a hunt or the desperate escape from a lethal threat. They were running as fast as their bodies could carry them, and they were running together. The pack structure collapsed into a knot of bodies moving as a single terrified organism. I swung the scope back to where they'd been bedded. The valley floor was empty. The snow surface where the pack had been resting showed the disturbed area of their bed site and nothing else. No animal, no approaching threat, no grizzly, no rival pack, no human, nothing that could account for 11 wolves abandoning a resting site at full sprint. I scanned the area around the bed site systematically, the way I'd been trained, working the scope in a grid pattern that covered the valley floor from the river to the ridge, and from a quarter-mile west of the bed site to a quarter-mile east. Nothing. The snow was unbroken. No tracks approaching the bed site except the wolves' own tracks arriving from the east. No scent source, which wouldn't have been visible through a scope, but which would have been accompanied by a source animal if the scent was strong enough to panic a pack at close range. The valley behind the running wolves was as empty as any piece of open ground I'd ever observed in 15 years of looking through this scope. The wolves ran for approximately 2 miles. I tracked them through the scope, watching the tight knot of panicked animals cover ground that would normally take them 20 minutes in about 4, running with the flat-out desperation of prey rather than the calculated efficiency of predators. At the 2-mile mark they slowed, the sprint degrading into a fast trot and then a walk, and then they stopped, the pack regrouping in a section of the valley near the confluence with Soda Butte Creek, and they turned around. All 11 of them, standing in a line, facing west, staring back at the section of valley they just fled, not relaxed, not returning to normal behavior, standing with the rigid, forward-leaning posture of wolves that are watching something, their ears forward, their tails held at mid-height, their bodies oriented toward a threat that they could see or sense or smell from 2 miles away, and that I could not detect through a scope that should have shown me everything the valley held. They stood like that for over an hour. 11 wolves, facing west, watching the empty valley, maintaining a vigilance that overrode every normal behavior pattern. No resting, no play, no social interaction, just 11 animals staring at the place they'd been and the thing that had driven them from it. I stayed on the ridge until dark, watching the wolves through the scope. They didn't move. They didn't return to their original position. They stood facing west until the light failed and I could no longer see them, and when I returned the following morning they were gone, relocated to a section of the valley 4 miles east of where they'd been bedded, further from the original bed site than I'd ever documented them moving in a single overnight displacement. They didn't return to that section of the valley for 3 days. I monitored their movements continuously, tracking them through the scope and through GPS collar data that the Wolf Project provided. For 3 days, the Junction Butte Pack avoided the section of the Lamar Valley where they'd been resting when the panic occurred. The territorial animals that normally ranged freely through their entire territory, giving a wide berth to a specific piece of ground that, as far as I could determine, held nothing threatening and showed no sign of disturbance. On the 4th day they went back, cautiously, the pack approaching the original bed site from the east, in a spread formation that was more characteristic of wolves approaching a rival pack's territory than of wolves returning to their own. They entered the area, checked it, and eventually resumed using it, the territorial routine re-establishing itself over the following days, as whatever had frightened them dissipated or left, or went back to wherever it had come from. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what happened. I've consulted with other wolf researchers, described the behavior without editorial comment, and listened to their explanations. The most common suggestion is a grizzly. A bear emerging from a winter den near the wolf's bed site could theoretically trigger a panic response, though bears in January in the Lamar Valley are almost never active, and a grizzly large enough to panic, 11 wolves would have been visible through my scope and would have left tracks in the snow. No tracks were found. The Wolf Project sent a field team to examine the bed site the following day, and they reported undisturbed snow around the wolves' resting area. No tracks of any large animal approaching or leaving. Another suggestion was a rival pack, but rival pack encounters produce aggression, not panic. Wolves that encounter a rival pack stand their ground or charge. They don't run in undifferentiated terror. The behavioral response I observed was not a territorial response. It was a prey response, the flight behavior of an animal that perceives a lethal threat and that chooses escape over confrontation. 11 wolves, the apex predator of the northern range, the animal that kills elk and faces down grizzlies and defends its territory against any challenger, running in panic from something that the most powerful spotting scope available couldn't find and that left no physical evidence of its presence. Something scared them. Something in that valley, in that section of the Lamar where the wolves had been resting, appeared or arrived or made itself known in a way that bypassed normal threat assessment and triggered an immediate flight response in every member of the pack simultaneously. Something that was too threatening to confront and too close to ignore and too invisible to document. I don't know what it was. 15 years of wolf research and the best optics money can buy, and I don't know what scared 11 wolves badly enough to run 2 miles at full sprint and then stand staring at the empty valley for an hour. The wolves know. They know what they ran from. They know what was in that valley. And they know, from the 3-day avoidance that followed, that whatever it was lingered in the area after they left, maintaining a presence that the wolves could detect from 4 miles away, and that kept them displaced from their own territory for 3 days. Something lives in the Lamar Valley that the wolves are afraid of. Something that doesn't leave tracks in the snow and doesn't show itself to spotting scopes and doesn't register on any monitoring equipment that the park maintains. Something that the most studied wolf pack in the world recognized instantly as a threat so severe that the only appropriate response was to run. And the valley holds its secret. The snow covers whatever tracks were never made. The cold erases whatever scent was never left. The landscape shows me what it's always shown me: elk and wolves and bison, and the slow drama of predator and prey playing out against a backdrop of mountains in winter. But beneath that drama, or beside it, or behind it, something else is there. Something that the wolves can detect and that I can't. Something that occupies the valley at times, and in ways that the science of wildlife management doesn't account for. Something that scared 11 wolves badly enough to run and then to stand and stare at the empty place where it had been. I watch the valley through my scope every winter. I watch the wolves. And I watch for the moment when the pack goes rigid, when the alpha female lurches to her feet, when 11 bodies that represent the most powerful predator in the ecosystem decide, in a single simultaneous instant, that being here is no longer safe. And when that happens, I watch the empty valley behind them, the snow surface that shows nothing, the meadow that holds nothing visible, the air that carries nothing my instruments can measure, and I wonder what the wolves see that I don't, and whether it's better that I can't see it, and whether the wolves, with their senses that are orders of magnitude more acute than mine, are the lucky ones for being able to detect the threat and run, or the unlucky ones for being able to perceive what lives in their valley, and for carrying the knowledge of it through every day they spend in the territory they can never fully own. The wolves know, and they're not telling. And the valley keeps what it keeps, beneath the snow and the silence and the flat January light, holding whatever it holds in the spaces between what the scope shows and what the wolves sense. Patient, invisible, present, and the wolves run. 8 years of fieldwork in Yellowstone thermal areas does something permanent to your sense of smell. Sulfur stops being an assault and becomes background, the same way traffic noise stops registering for people who live near a highway. By the time September of 2022 came around, I could walk into an active fumarole field and my brain simply filed the hydrogen sulfide away as environmental context, not worth conscious attention. That's relevant because when I say I noticed the smell, I mean I noticed something that broke through 8 years of calibrated indifference. Something that my body registered as wrong before my mind had assembled the words for it. The mud volcano area sits in a hydrothermal basin in the central part of the park, and the section I was working that September was remote enough from the main boardwalk that most visitors never see it. The accessible parts of Mud Volcano, the Dragon's Mouth, the features along the maintained trail represent a fraction of the thermal activity in that basin. The rest of it is working ground, documented in our survey databases, visited by field teams with instruments and sample kits, and the particular situational awareness you develop when you spend enough time in places where the ground can fail beneath you without warning. I'd worked that section a dozen times. I knew its features, its smell, its particular combination of active vents and bubbling mud pools, and the low-frequency acoustic presence of a hydrothermal system doing what hydrothermal systems do. I was on my third sampling station of the morning when it hit me. The fumarole cluster I was working was modest 4 active vents in a rough line along a low ridge of bleached sinter, each one putting out a steady column of steam and gas that the September air was cool enough to make visible for 30 or 40 feet before it dispersed. Routine. I'd taken readings at the first 2 stations without anything to note beyond normal variation in temperature and flow rate. I'd moved to the 3rd station, set down my kit, and was reaching for the gas sampling wand when the smell reached me. It came with a shift in the wind direction, moving from behind the fumarole cluster toward me, and it was so completely different from the sulfur baseline that my body responded before I could think. My stomach turned over, my eyes watered. I stood up straight and took an involuntary step backward, the sampling wand still in my hand, and for a moment, I wasn't a geologist with a decade of field experience. I was just an animal that had smelled something its nervous system categorized as dangerous. Decomposition. The specific, sweet, heavy, wrongly warm smell of something large that has been dead long enough. Not fresh death, which has its own sharp quality. The smell of tissue in the process of breaking down, the biological machinery of decay running at full operation, the smell that, in my experience, means something the size of a bison or larger has died nearby and has been dead for days. In the backcountry, it isn't a rare smell. Large animals die, and their deaths alter the air around them for a significant radius. I knew the smell. I'd encountered it before, always attached to a visible source. I looked for the carcass. I spent 20 minutes searching the area around the fumarole cluster, working in expanding arcs from the vent that seemed most directly upwind of where I'd been standing. Bison and elk sometimes enter thermal areas and die there. The ground looks stable, isn't stable, and the animal goes through a thin cinder crust into superheated water or acidic mud. It's documented. When it happens, there's usually physical evidence: bones, if the remains are old enough, or the disturbing partial remains of something that died in water too hot to allow normal decomposition processes to proceed. I was looking for any of that. I found nothing. No carcass, no bones, no disturbed ground at the thermal margins, no circling ravens that, in my experience, are reliable indicators of a large dead animal in the vicinity. Nothing. Green-gray sinter and bleached soil, and the 4 fumaroles putting out their steady columns, and the smell coming from all of them. I stood downwind of the cluster and made myself think through it carefully rather than trust my initial read. The smell was not ambient. It wasn't dispersed across the basin the way a carcass would disperse its smell across the surrounding area. It was concentrated, directional. It was coming from the vents, rising with the steam, mixed into the gas output of the fumaroles themselves, as if the source was not on the surface but below it, in the thermal plumbing, somewhere in the system of superheated water and pressurized gas that feeds surface features from below. I took the gas samples. All 4 vents, full protocol, labeled and sealed and packaged with the temperature and flow data. The work settled me somewhat. Procedure has that effect, when your hands know what to do and can do it without requiring your full attention. I finished the station, moved to the 4th vent, took those samples too, and hiked out. I wrote a full field note before I left the area, including the smell, including the absence of any visible source, including my observation that the odor appeared to originate from the fumaroles rather than from a surface carcass. I filed it with my data report that evening. The lab results came back 10 days later. I've worked with volcanic gas chemistry long enough to know the normal signature of this area's fumaroles, the proportions of water vapor and carbon dioxide and hydrogen sulfide, and trace gases that constitute the baseline output of a hydrothermal system in this part of the park. I know what normal looks like. The results from those 4 vents were not normal. Elevated organic compounds. Specifically, a profile of volatile organic compounds consistent with the decomposition of biological material, the gases produced when proteins and lipids